Hello. Hi, Julie.
Hi.
So good afternoon and welcome everybody to this afternoon's program at the Commonwealth Club. My name is Robert Rosenthal and I'm a board member and longtime journalist, and I'm now a board member at the Center for Investigative Reporting. Earlier in my career, I did work in Philadelphia, and we were not in the same newspaper, but we certainly just reminisced about some places we loved in Philly, including cheesesteaks. Without Julie's really heroic journalistic efforts at the Miami Herald, we may never have known what we know today about Jeffrey Epstein. And while, of course, much remains a mystery about Epstein, we know more about his victims and the failure of the judicial system than we ever did because of Julie's reporting. Based on her reporting, Julie's new book was published this week, Perversion of Justice, the Jeffrey Epstein Story. And it reads, I'm sorry to say it's not fiction, but it's true, but it reads like a novel. And it's not only a story about what it really takes to do great investigative reporting. It's a story about passion, taking risks, the challenges a single mom faced doing this kind of work. It's a story about what's happened to the newspaper industry in terms of its downsizing. And really, it's a story about the role of the press in a democracy. And when people like Julie and the Miami Herald did what they did, it truly makes a difference. Before we start, I just want to frame what we're going to do today. And I know you've had a lot of interviews, so I'll give you 2 minutes to rest. But I wanted to read from the preface in your book because it sort of frames what we're going to be talking about today. And I thought it would just set up what we're doing. And Julie wrote this in the preface. This was only written a few months ago. This book, as I said, came out this week. This is what Julie wrote. The Jeffrey Epstein story epitomizes our nation's lopsided system of justice and how victims of sexual assault, especially those who are young and poor, are discarded, shamed, and mistreated by the very people who are supposed to protect them. Epstein got away with his crimes because nearly every element of society allowed him to get away with them. Professional, legal, and moral ethics were set aside for a broken system of values that places corporate profits, personal wealth, political connections, and celebrity above some of the most sacred tenets of our faiths, our teachings, and our democracy. When I became a journalist, I learned that the most rewarding part of my work was in writing injustices for those who could not fight for themselves. Few people seem to recognize that Epstein not only beat the system, but he was probably still hunting, terrorizing, and abusing young women and girls. I would face many obstacles on my path to the truth. I would be attacked by the legal forces who failed their solemn oaths, by the defense attorneys who profited off of Epstein's crimes, by some of those within my own industry who thought that what I was doing was nothing more than a rehash of an old story. So, Julie, you've been in this business a while, and like every great story, it has a beginning. Can you take us to the point where you first really got hooked into doing the story, and also about some of the events that already had transpired that you may or may not have been aware of?
Well, in late 2016, I was in the middle of a long-term investigation into Florida prisons. But it was winding down, and I really wanted to try to move on to something different. So I had done some work in the women's prison, and I knew that sex trafficking was a real problem in Florida. So I started doing some research on sex trafficking in Florida, and every time I Googled those two subjects, Jeffrey Epstein's name popped up. I read a column by one of our former columnists, Fred Grimm, that really took the criminal justice system and the prosecutors in this case to task for how they handled it. Nothing that I read seemed to make sense of it. It just, here was a man who was accused of molesting countless girls, and he seemed to get away with a slap on the wrist. So I just started kind of picking away at it and looking at it. And as I was doing that, requesting some public records, Donald Trump nominated a man by the name of Alex Acosta to be his labor secretary. I was aware that by that time I was aware that Acosta was the prosecutor, former Miami prosecutor, who had signed off on this lenient plea deal for Epstein. So I watched his confirmation hearings thinking he was going to be grilled over this deal. And to my surprise, hardly any of the senators really brought much of it up. And it was clear from the little bit that they did question him about it that they didn't understand the scope or the breadth of this horrible deal that Acosta had signed off on.
And just
So
frame it a little bit, because now you're talking about a period that's 8 years after the deal. Is that right? So this
that's correct.
So this had lain dormant for 8 years, and then you start poking at it again.
Yeah, because it was one of those things where I would read a story and I'd think, what? How did this happen? And none of the stories that I read answered how something like that could happen. So I was curious about that fact. And then when this nomination happened, I thought, I wonder what the victims, this was a crime that happened 10 years before. This would mean that the victims were now in their late 20s, early 30s. And, the labor secretary post was one with oversight of human trafficking and child labor laws. And I thought, I wonder what Epstein's victims think about this man who had allowed their predator essentially almost off the hook, now taking over the reins of this huge department.
So the hook for you was empathy and compassion and thinking about these young women and how they might be sitting there thinking about what was going on if they're aware of what Acosta had done in terms of cutting this plea deal with and letting Epstein basically almost walk.
Right. And then I also saw that Epstein, even though his crime, he had already served the short jail sentence that he had been given many, many years before, having been released in 2009. He went back to his jet-setting life. I realized it was almost as if he got to go back to his normal everyday life, making money and hobnobbing with all these important people. And in my mind, I'm thinking, I bet the girls, who suffered this aren't living the same lives that they had led. And that in my mind, I'm thinking, I felt a gut instinct that they were still probably suffering trauma from this.
And at this point, from the court filings and documents that you were looking at, had you begun actually, human sourcing yet, or you just were looking and reading what was on the record?
I was just at that point just looking and reading the documents because it was a very old case. And I was looking for a hook, quite frankly, if I wanted to do it. You always have to pitch it to your editor, and you have to have, some kind of reason for looking into a case that's that old. And it was just coincidental that Acosta was nominated right around the time I was poking at it, number one. And that, I also saw that there was one lawsuit, a civil lawsuit, that was still lingering.
Mm-hmm.
That it seemed like I wondered why it was hanging on after all these years.
And did you, at that point, know the name of any of these young women, or were they all Jane Does in the filings?
They were all Jane Does.
So take us through. Okay, so you've got this, your gut, you're tingling. There's something wrong here. You have a hook in that the U.S. attorney who had basically let this guy off. And in the documents you were looking at, I believe there were dozens of young women who had alleged that they had been, or that the detectives had found, were going to testify that they had been sexually abused by Jeffrey Epstein and when they were minors. Is that right?
That's correct.
So you had dozens of cases. It wasn't one or two or three or four. And I believe the documents hinted that there were many more.
That's right. It seemed there was information in the FBI. The little bit of FBI information that we had was that the FBI agents who were investigating it were interested in traveling to New York and New Mexico, which were two other places where Epstein owned homes. And while it didn't say why, it was clear to me that they were probably trying to find out whether he had been abusing girls in these other places.
So you have a situation where some of the people in law enforcement, probably you're wondering, were they coerced or went along with this, and probably others from your experience, might have been outraged. What steps then do you then take to begin finding the sources who could be? Who did you then go look for?
Well, I reached out to, first of all, one of the other things I noticed about it was that as a police, most of my career was spent being a police reporter, crime reporter. So the first thing I thought, well, the police, who was the lead detective 10 years ago? Who was the police chief? And in doing my research, I learned that the lead detective of the case, Joe Recarey, had retired, and so had the police chief, Mike Ryder. And yet they had never spoken publicly at all about the case. The only public information we had were 2 depositions that they had given many, many years earlier, I think in like 2010. So these were even dated interviews, and they were court depositions, which, as you probably know, are pretty boring documents. I set out really first to try to get them to go on the record.
So this, I hope this conversation isn't too inside the newsroom, because what I'm really trying to draw out here is how one reporter, one person who's got instincts and passion and guts, and a very strong will, can truly make a difference. And it applies to many things in life. So you then go, you have a couple of names. They've never spoken on the record outside whatever they did in a document. And how do you go about finding them and then convincing them, based on probably their own cynicism about no one's going to do anything about this? What's the process, and how long did that take?
Well, that process took a lot longer than I expected. I think my editor was getting a little antsy because it was taking so long. I was trying to explain, look, these victims' names aren't in any of the documents. It's just going to be a painstaking process to go through all the documents. And basically what I did was started reading everything. And, doing this, as I said, so many years, it's inevitable that they miss a name, or they have the first name and not the last name, or they have the first name and then the date of birth. So it was this big puzzle, and I did a spreadsheet, and I would put what information I had on each victim. It would only be scraps of information. And from those scraps of information, I looked at some of a lot of these women had sued Epstein in the years since this happened. Of course, they were all listed as Jane Does, but I would have to read each of those lawsuits in order to get it. I had a file for Jane Doe 1, Jane Doe 2, Jane Doe all the way up to 120 something. And so I would just keep filling these files, and I used social media. A lot of these women, for example, if I found one woman on Facebook, let's just say she was, Jan Smith, I could look at her friends on Facebook, and, it's really kind of creepy at times because Epstein had a certain kind of type. He liked very petite, blonde hair, blue-eyed. I mean, they looked very similar. So I would just basically look at their friends who all look, that look like that. And slowly I began to piece together. The list just grew.
And by now, that in the initial go-round in 2005, 6, 7, when Epstein was dealing with this and basically got off very leniently, he brought in lawyers like Kenneth Starr and Alan Dershowitz. You knew you were going up against Spaceship Galactica, right? What did that signal to you also?
Well, it signaled to me that I better let our executive editor know what I was doing. So I knocked on Mindy's. Mindy Marquez was our executive editor at the time. And, I said, look, do you have a second? I want to tell you what I'm working on. And so we just talked about the case, and I told them this might be a rough one because we're going up some very powerful people, and he has a legal arsenal that, that potentially would threaten to sue us. But I told her the story, and I told her about the women, and she ultimately said, go for it.
And so this is around what point? 2017?
Yeah.
Early?
Yeah,
And so you're basically going through months and months of reading documents, trying to figure out how to find these Jane Does, getting sources, McCarty, Ritter, the former law enforcement, the chief, and this is in Palm Beach again, to try and speak to you. And that's
that's right.
months of work, is that right?
Yeah, tracking down the women was the most time consuming, and trying to get them to talk was
Right.
the most time consuming part of
So
the.
let me ask you a question, because in the book you weave in something that I found really interesting and surprising, your own story. Your family comes in, you're a single mom, your kids become almost second, characters. And you also talk about your own upbringing. Were you conscious of the fact that there was something in there did you ever think I could have been one of these girls?
I wasn't conscious of it when I started the project at all. I didn't become conscious of it until I started interviewing women. And especially, I interviewed a couple of their moms. And the stories that their moms told me reminded me just of my own mother, and the struggle she had as a single mom. And, quite frankly, I had a tough growing up, and I had put it out of my head. It was sort of like a reckoning of my own without me really planning on it that way, that I just started thinking about, wow, I remember when my mom had to, work two jobs. She was a waitress part-time, and she wasn't home a whole lot. And, we were latchkey kids, and, as I said, it slowly dawned on me that I had a lot in common with these women, but I didn't do this story for that reason. I just, it just kind of happened that way.
Well, some of the best journalists have tremendous compassion, and there are victims in any situation. You want to be able to tell their story and hopefully make it relevant so other people can understand what they went through. And that really came through. Julie, take us through, the reporting here, and it's hard to explain, I think, to a non-journalist audience that's, I don't know how many thousands of pages of documents you read, trying to track people down. I know one of the heroines in the story is the librarian. I think her name was
Yeah, Monica. Yeah,
Monica Leal.
Yeah, I felt that still feel that librarians don't get a lot of credit in our business, and they're very important to what we do. The other real heroine also was my partner, Emily Michaud, who was my videographer and photographer, who worked on this project with me from the get-go, and was a real important. It's important to hear this story. We put together the documentaries as well as to see the story as much as it is to read the story. She made these women very three-dimensional and very, no one could tell the story really better than the women themselves, and these documentaries did that.
Well, and I think I want to get to that sort of the interview process, but was there a point in this early reporting where you suddenly felt outrage?
Pretty much from the beginning, I just couldn't. I was outraged from the very beginning. I just couldn't understand how someone like that could have gotten away with this, and that's what made me want to do it. Because to be honest with you, I felt like it was like an unsolved crime that I had to solve, and I thought I knew a lot had been written about it, but as I said, I don't think the answers were really known. So I set out to really solve this mystery.
And you knew, I think, that you had to get as many of these young women, now a little older, on the record to tell their story. So can you take can you take
that was
us
critical.
Yeah, can you take us through how you found the first couple of women and what you had to do to get them their trust? And I think, again, one of the most difficult things a reporter or journalist has to do is speak to people who've lost something, victims of something. In this case, sexual abuse or rape is really difficult to win the trust and the sensitivity you need to do that. But can you just take it through the process and at some of the first meetings?
Well, before I even met with them, I had it instinctively. I knew that this was going to be an issue where I was going to be asking these women, whom I had never met before, about the worst time of their life. And I knew that some of them had probably never told anybody that this had happened. They were very young. And I was concerned that I was going to perhaps re-traumatize them. So I spoke with some people who do these kinds of interviews for a living to get some insight into how to handle it. And one of the things that I concluded was that I didn't need to force them to talk about the abuse, the physical abuse, that it was more important that I tell them, look, you don't have to talk about this. There's no question that this happened. Epstein never denied that he did any of this. That was the other thing. He never denied he did it. He once compared what he did to stealing a bagel. He just didn't think that he did anything wrong. So there was never a question that this had happened. So I didn't need for them to tell me about the rapes. I just needed them to talk about what it had done to them and how they, were treated by the criminal justice system.
Take us through the first interview with Emily and what that was like and your own feelings.
Well, first of all, the one thing that I did, I started thinking this would be like any other story. You go knock on the door and you tell the person that you want to interview what you want to talk to them about. And then when I did that, one of the women's fathers answered the door, and I thought, oh my gosh, this isn't going to work because I can't tell her father why I'm there. He might not even know. So I did another story before that where I wrote the victim of a slain Navy SEAL. I wrote his father a letter explaining what I wanted to do, and the father did call me, and I got an exclusive interview with them. And I wrote 60 letters, to all the women that at that time that I had tracked down, and included what I wanted to do. I included a couple of clips about how Epstein had already tried to get his sex offender registration lowered in New York. So he's trying to really weasel, out of any kind of restrictions that were placed on him after he got out of jail. So I wrote all these letters, and I got one woman called me, Michelle Licata, who lived outside of Nashville. And she confessed to me that her lawyer told her not to call me, and her lawyer told her not to talk to me. And I just had a talk with her on the phone, and I told her what I wanted to do. And she said, okay, come. And Emily and I didn't know when we set out to travel to Tennessee, whether she was actually going to go through with it, because we knew she had some misgivings. And, we sat there and we interviewed her for, oh gosh, it had to be at least 3 hours. And it was just extremely emotional. Emily and I really, I think, didn't really understand the depth of the trauma that she and other women had gone through. She only went to Epstein one time, by the way. And it just, with that one time, it really almost destroyed her life. And to hear her tell, and that's one of the powerful parts of the book. I mean, I touched upon that, and Emily, of course, did a brilliant job of it in the documentary. But you only get so many minutes in a documentary and so many inches in a story. So in the book, I was able to really talk about that whole interview, and and with each of these women, their whole story, because it's important to understand that, yes, these girls took money, but they were really misled, and they were really,
why don't you go into the detail of what the method was? I mean, I don't want to assume everybody understands what was happening here, how his system basically worked. And how it wasn't just Jeffrey Epstein, there was a whole infrastructure around him, and many, many people were aware of what were going on. Can you just describe that for us? What was actually the methodology?
Yeah, Jeffrey Epstein had a whole ecosystem around him of people that helped him. I mean, he was a guy that really didn't even tie his own shoelaces. He had, he had somebody to do everything for him. And so these people that were part of his, his life, or this system that he had built, were, involved everyone from the butler who answered the door where these girls were, to a chef who was in the kitchen who, made them snacks, to the women, of course. He had other young women who arranged his schedule, to the, the housekeepers who cleaned up after, he did these incidents, and the pilots who flew the jets, where he had two private planes. The driver, he had drivers, that picked up the girls. So it was a whole ecosystem around him of people that that really aided and helped this move.
Well, also, I think in the book, you really describe how, in some cases, the first meeting where a young girl, she might be a runaway, she might be in distress, she's somewhere, she needs help. It was almost as if you had, a wounded animal, or, I don't mean that, but just somebody and people out looking for the girls who fit a physical description that he sought after. I mean, they were out hunting, really.
That was by design. I mean, he could have had the most sophisticated, expensive prostitutes that his money could buy, but that's not what he wanted. He wanted scared little girls. That was, what he wanted. And he didn't even want them one or two. He wanted a revolving door of them all the time. That was part of his sickness. And so he, like I said, he just had, and then, the most insidious part of this of all was when these girls, of course, became like, scared and they didn't want to do it. He said, "Oh, don't worry about it. You don't have to do it. Just bring me your friends and I'll pay you the same amount of money." So he had the girls that he victimized, didn't want to be victimized anymore, but they needed the money for whatever reason. They were on the street or they were in a foster home. And they just would go to parties and bring their friends, or bring not even people that were their friends, people that they would meet, acquaintances that they met in the mall, or at the gym or wherever. So he had, he had a whole legion of recruiters.
Yeah, and we're not even really getting into the men, and in some cases the women who surrounded him. Some of the most best-known people, politicians, businessmen, corporate leaders who were part of this world in some way. And I guess that's still one of the unclear mysteries. There's so much to go to here. And I want to sort of try and keep it in a little bit of chronology, but can you also, one of the things that also was quite revelatory in the book was your exploration of the two islands in the Virgin Islands. Can you talk about that and sort of what was going on there and how that was part of this world of Jeffrey Epstein and his friends? And what also his method of indebting himself to local officials and government people, either through philanthropy or donations or building something, this sort of almost 360-degree system he created.
Right. Well, he couldn't have picked a better place to, further his crimes than this island that he bought off the coast of St. Thomas. The only way you can get to it is by helicopter or by boat. And he, it's also a place where the people on St. Thomas are pretty poor. And the politicians, he ingratiated himself with the government officials and the politicians. The wife of the then governor went to work for Epstein. I think she worked for him for many years, like 10 years. So he donated, tens of thousands, maybe even, hundreds of thousands of dollars to build schools there, built, the first music school, soccer programs. I mean, you just name it. It was just anything that he could throw his money at. So inevitably, these people came to, know him as somebody as somewhat of a benefactor, and they, turned their eye, turn their heads the other way when he was bringing in all these girls on his private plane. He would fly into the airport at St. Thomas on his private plane, and then go to a hangar, an area that wasn't completely visible to everyone, disembark with the girls, and then they would usually hop on a helicopter that was kept there, and then they would be flown to the island.
And one of the things that you were, I think, still looking for, and maybe you're still looking for, are manifests. Is that right? Who flew on these flights, and is also who flew around, and you've been unable to get a lot of those, right? In other words, who he was flying with, and Homeland Security has blocked that. Is that still true?
Yeah, because unfortunately, when I started doing this was after my series ran, and I was trying to get information on that. And I first did the public records request before Epstein's arrest. I did get some of it, but it was heavily redacted. And before I could pressure and get anything more about it, he was arrested. And then, of course, then it was an open criminal investigation, and I wasn't going to get anything. I'm told I need to just move my light a little closer here. It's getting dark here in Florida, and so let me just move my light. Excuse me. This is better. Okay, how's that? A little bit better anyway.
Well, you look good to me. So, I mean, I can see you. But so since is that because of his death, though? Is that stuff now sealed, or can anyone get at it? I don't want to tip any.
I don't think they're going to give us anything on that. Because I know he's gone now, but the case is still open, and theoretically, I guess they're still looking at other people besides even Ghislaine Maxwell, who is indicted in connection with his sex trafficking operation.
One of the things, to switch direction a little bit, Julie, in the book, and I mentioned it earlier, what was your thinking as a reporter? I mean, a lot of times in traditional journalism, you sort of, I'll call it behind the curtain. You don't get into your life, your ups and downs, the challenges of being a single mom. Was that a decision you wanted to make? Was that your editor, your book editor? Can you get into, because your children, as I said earlier, and there's some wonderful scenes there as a parent, why did you do that?
Well, my editor, it was partially my editor thought that this story, and I fought it, actually. I didn't want to do that initially. I said, look, I'll do this. I really don't want to be in the story, and then as I was working on it, this was around the time of, Trump, and all the things that he was tweeting out that weren't true, and the journalists being painted as the enemy of the people. And, after this series ran, I was, one of the biggest surprises to me was how much fan mail, quite frankly, that I got. Journalists never get fan mail, but just a lot of, thank you notes from people saying, finally, this is what journalism is, and this is why it's important. And it occurred to me that, journalists aren't always very good at telling people what we do and how we go about it. We just do it. And I do think that at this time in history, that it's important that we explain to people what we do, because because of Trump and because of all the things that have happened, I think a good deal of America has become distrustful of journalists. And so I thought maybe I should tell them what I did so they understand this isn't an effort to cover anything up. This is an effort to find the truth. And that's, I think, what most journalists do, and so I thought I'm going to put a little bit of this in here because I think it's important for our country. And especially given the fact that newspapers, small newspapers all over this country are disappearing, and I don't think the public realizes how devastating that is to our democracy, that we're losing small newspapers all over the country.
Mm-hmm. Well, here I agree. And your work certainly shows the difference you can make. One of the, and it's really complicated to get into. I mean, the perversion of justice, is I think a perfect title, because once you get into this and you see all the things that happen, and it's probably pretty complicated to explain it here in terms of the system and the players you talk about and some of the stuff you had access to, and explaining decisions that were made to protect Jeffrey Epstein. And also, one of the things we haven't talked about was the ferocity of his attorneys going after the victims.
Yeah.
And which is appalling when you read about it. And can you talk a little bit about that and what that did to some of these young women in addition to the initial trauma?
Well, just imagine you're 14 years old and you did something horrible that you are very ashamed of, and the police find out about it, and they come and they knock on your door, and they want to talk to you, and of course you got to explain to your parents why the police are talking to you, and you have to confess, look, I went to this guy's house, I thought I was just giving him a massage, and here's what happened. And then after that happens, the next thing you know, you have a man that you don't even know, just either following you or knocking or coming into the little bagel shop where you work, and coming, and your boss is standing there, and it's a official looking man, and he said, we need to talk to you. And then it turns out it's a private investigator that's working for Jeffrey Epstein, and they want to sit down with you, and then they tell you, look, if you basically, they tell you, if you work with us, you'll be fine. And if you don't work with us, then you're not going to be fine. And your family might not be fine. Or your father is followed, and there's headlights in his rearview mirror, and they run him off the road. I mean, this was really happening with these victims. And the fact that prosecutors knew that it was happening and they didn't do anything to stop it is just, I don't even know what the words were for it. I was just so shocked.
Have any of those people been held to account? I know several lost their jobs after your stories came out, but after the initial go-around, really nothing happened to anybody.
No. You know what? The only people really who have paid a price in this whole thing are women, from the victims to even the prosecutors, the prosecutors that advocated for them, both the lead state prosecutor and the federal prosecutor were women.
Right.
But the cases went nowhere because their bosses, who happened to all be men, sort of, excused what he did and said, look, these victims aren't credible. They're prostitutes. It wasn't a big deal. There were all these excuses that were made.
Yeah. Can you, getting more maybe, talk about, in every story, there's also an editor who sometimes is behind the curtain. Your interactions with Casey Frank are quite candid, and your thoughts about editors are pretty candid. I didn't take any umbrage. But talk about Casey Frank and the relationship you had and how that either helped or hindered, or, the whole back and forth.
Well, it's journalism, it can be very messy, and especially when you have two headstrong people. I'm very headstrong, and I'm quite candid about myself as well. I said that I'm a hard person to deal with myself. I wasn't always, I was an editor at one point, not long, because I wasn't very good at it, and I was tough to some reporters, and I regret it. And so it is this dynamic where you're sometimes, at cross purposes. And Casey's been my editor for probably almost the entire time, 13 years I've been at the Herald. We are almost always on the same page with the kind of stories that we think are important, but sometimes the way that I want to go about it isn't the way that he thinks I should go about it. So, and as I said, I'm pretty stubborn and headstrong, and so is he sometimes. So we clashed, and I was honest about that. And I don't know. In the end, in my acknowledgments, I said, however, we would have never had some of the stories that we had if that didn't happen. The same thing that made us clash, I think, was the very thing that made our stories so important. And so, we just covered all the bases because we had to come together in the end for the sake of the story.
Were you able to share your fears? I mean, literal fears that you and Emily had during this process, and what did he do to either assuage them or help you? What kind of, did you set up a system in case strange things happened, or the knock at the door, that type of thing?
Well, it's funny.
Fear.
I had some weird things happen with the prison stories that I had done. I remember calling Casey one time, after someone had showed up at my apartment in the middle of the night. I was pretty scared during the prison series. The Epstein series, I don't know, for whatever reason, it didn't really spook me until after the series ran and I was deep into it. So I didn't really have a reason to talk to him about that. Emily, however, it was a lot different than I am. She was a lot more paying attention to what was going on. I was a little bit more busy about the story. We're two different personalities that way, so we're a good balance with each other. But she would be like, "Are you crazy? Why would you do that?" So, and the book goes into a couple of those anecdotes about Emily and I, with her throwing the furniture in front of the hotel room door and me just falling asleep because I'm thinking, whatever, Emily. Like I said, it wasn't until after we knew that it was really serious, that now Epstein was going to be arrested, or, the Congress had asked for a Justice Department investigation. That's when weird things started happening. People showing up, van parked in front of Emily's house around the clock, people showing up outside my apartment, which is not an easy place to it's not a place that people would be walking by. You have to go in an elevator and come up, and it was just odd things. Look, I firmly believe that there were people that were investigating Emily and I. They had to, because the case had just gotten so hot, and Epstein, from the beginning after the series ran, was afraid that he was going to be charged. I just know that because some people around him told me he was worried he was going to be charged.
You explain Bruce Springsteen's role in your work?
Just whenever I have a lot of anxiety, I always turn him on and just listen to him. He's, after a long day writing, and I grew up, as we mentioned earlier, in Philadelphia, and I spent my summers at the Jersey Shore. And it just, he's a great storyteller. He's brilliant. And I think his stories just helped make me, comforted me in some way. And so, especially when I was writing the book, I was listening. I would, after a long day of writing, I just would turn on Sirius Radio and just play him the whole entire night, to the point that my kids were like rolling their eyes, like, "Please, Mom, do we have to really listen to Bruce Springsteen again?" Kind of thing. So it was kind of part of the fabric of my life when this story was unfolding. And, it's a very dark story. It's a very, people said, how did you do this? This is really like you could really get depressed doing this. And I think just it was something that helped keep me going, kind of.
Yeah, it is a dark story, and I'm going to get back to darkness now. Near the end of the book, one of the chapters is, Jeffrey Epstein did not kill himself. So that's a statement. And so can you explain and take us through either the process of using that headline or that chapter title, or is that something you believe?
This is what I think. I used it sort of because that's what everybody was. It was sort of a thing that was all over social media and everywhere. I mean, in our culture, you turned on TV, it was there. In the Mardi Gras parade, my son went to Mardi Gras and they had a float of Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein did not commit suicide. It became this, I don't know, this mantra. And I did look at this, and people would always ask me when I was doing a lot of college talks at this time, journalism classes, and people would ask me, and I had to be honest with myself. I really didn't think he was capable of committing suicide by himself. Now, could he have? Could it have been assisted suicide? Yes. I think if we want to think that he wanted to end it, I think someone must have helped him. I just don't think he was capable. I mean, and I'm not the only one that thinks this. His brother thinks that. His lawyers think that. The forensic pathologist that was at the autopsy doesn't believe that he killed himself. There are just too many strange things that happen. I mean, he had 3 bones broken in his neck, and Dr. Michael Baden, the forensic pathologist at the autopsy, said you rarely in that kind of a hanging have 3 bones broken in your neck. Keep in mind, the theory was that he did this with the bed sheets, cutting these up, and that he kind of pulled himself against the bunk. He tied it to the top bunk, and he would have had to pull himself with such there really wasn't, according to Baden, enough velocity, enough room there for him to have done this and broken 3 bones. And the toiletries that were on top of his bunk weren't even disturbed. So, and then you have 2 guards that are asleep at the wheel. Then you have video disappear. Then you find out that, the guy that was in the cell with him was taken out just hours before this happened. I mean, it's just I've done crime reporting and especially prison deaths for a long time. And my gut just tells me that this was not, just a suicide that he did by himself.
Well, the way you wrote that chapter, certainly all these questions you're raising are laid out in a really coherent way. Now, there is an inquiry, isn't there? Or is that the U.S. Attorney's Office is supposed to be doing something? Is New York on it? Is that happening, or do you have any idea?
New York is looking at, the 2 corrections officers that were on duty already struck a plea deal, so they're quiet. Here we go again with everything that's being sealed, and nobody's talking about that part of it. And then there's a separate Justice Department investigation by the Inspector General of the Justice Department that is still ongoing. I don't know why it's taking this long. So that's still open. So, and even if the ruling comes out, whatever that ruling is, I don't know whether the evidence will ever be made public.
Yeah, that's as you allude to. Let's jump more to the present now. Ghislaine Maxwell, will you be covering her trial, and what do you think will be coming out of that?
Well, Ghislaine Maxwell is sort of taking a page out of the Jeffrey Epstein defense playbook, in that she's hired a team of very high-powered lawyers who have previous experience in the Justice Department, and they are bombarding the prosecutors with all kinds of paperwork, motions and just anything that they can kind of throw at the wall, hoping that it's going to, they're looking for some kind of a loophole. They're going to inevitably argue that she was part of that original, in the original deal that Epstein struck in 2008, there was this strange sort of codicil to the deal where his co-conspirators, 4 of whom were named, they were 4 women who helped him with his schedule, were given immunity as well as some unnamed people that we still don't know who they were. And that her lawyers will argue that she was one of those people. Now, whether that'll stick remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, Acosta really shows up in this again and again, and there's, the Justice Department. I mean, one of the details in the book you wrote, did a review and basically found him making guilty of poor judgment but no ethical lapses. And then there's a footnote in that report that says that many of his emails have vanished.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't say anybody else's disappeared. And it's not just his emails, it's his emails during the period when this deal was done have vanished. So, I guess it wasn't like they said, well, he had a major loss of all his emails. It was the emails during the period when this deal was negotiated that disappeared.
Yeah. So in Epstein's will, which he wrote a couple of days before he was found dead, right? He listed his net worth, I think, he's $578 million. Now, I think you said in the end of the book, and these numbers may have changed, that a victims' compensation fund was created, and that I think you said 175 women have filed claims as alleged victims, and so far $67 million has been paid out. So are those women you were aware of, or what's the process there? Can you talk about that?
Well, we don't really know a lot about them, but I know some of the lawyers who represented them, and these are women, some of whom, by the way, have said that Epstein essentially trafficked them out to some of these important men, but they are afraid to come forward. I mean, you look at someone like Alan Dershowitz, who has attacked the woman that was that accused him for years. I mean, he has sued her. He has, he has made her life really miserable. And I even got, when this was happening, I even got emails and a couple of phone calls from some people who knew Alan Dershowitz and said that they would never say anything about what they know because we're afraid of him, and that's what these these attorneys who represent some of these women said, that they're never going to go public because they're too afraid of what the men will put them through.
Yeah, when you read the book, the list of men who allegedly were involved here is fairly astonishing. And the denials everywhere, and then also what seems to be some very strong evidence from some of these women, and also the pattern. The pattern is there. It's not like necessarily even one-offs. I mean, you really establish patterns here, which you must have seen in the reporting.
Yes. It took a while to put a lot of it together because not all of it was in one place. There were different, there was a state investigation, the federal investigation, and the FBI report, and then the civil lawsuits. And so there were a lot of different pieces. And I think that that's another thing, another piece of it that I kind of put together in this book, because, when you're doing a piece like this, there's so much information and you can't always put everything in the story. So this kind of delves more into some of those details that I couldn't include in the original story.
For you, do you feel like you're done with this, or you still want to be engaged? I mean, now I guess you're starting a book tour, or at least a virtual book tour. I'm sure you're exhausted. I want to see it through, but I'm also mindful. One of the other things I talk about in this book is how I was on other stories. Some people said, "Well, it must be nice to do that, and nothing else." Well, that's not how it worked. I was doing the Parkland shootings. I was doing the shooting at the Fort Lauderdale airport. I was covering other things when this happened, and we just unfortunately had this horrible tragedy here in Surfside, and when you work for a paper, a smaller paper, you just don't have the luxury of just going off on one thing. I probably have a little bit more of that luxury than other reporters, but you really have to join in on the coverage. You just have to. Yeah, I'll give for the audience some context. 20 years ago or so, Julie would have been what they call detached, just to work on this, and had the freedom to do it. But these days, as newsrooms are about probably a fifth of what they were, so sometimes it's all hands in, even when she's in the middle of a huge and important story like this. So again, I just think it speaks volumes about your persistence and your work ethic and your determination to do this. And I know how difficult that is, and I respect the hell out of it. Here's a question from the audience, and you've touched on it a couple of times. But what are some of the questions, remaining mysteries, about what Jeff Epstein that you wonder about, and that you have any potential hope anything will come out?
Oh my God.
The loose threads.
We don't have enough time for all that. I mean, I think one of the things, for example, is, didn't anybody keep track? Here was a guy who was a convicted sex offender, accused of molesting girls, and he gets out of jail in 2009, and nobody's paying attention to where he's flying his plane and who's on his plane. I mean, it's just mind-boggling to me. Does anybody watch these people when they get out, and make sure that they're not, getting other girls from, Eastern Europe and bringing them to our country? It just seemed to me that he wasn't having any problems after he got out of jail. He returned to his regular life and no one was paying any attention to him. So, that's one thing I think should absolutely be looked at. I mean, why weren't they checking his plane when he got off in St. Thomas and asking those girls how old they were?
Yeah, that one really jumped out. And I think in the book you also show that there were in fact young women or girls brought from overseas to New
Right.
York, and the who's who. Can you talk a little bit about the who's who of the mansion in New York, and also one of the details I think in one of the hearings to not give him bail when he was still alive was that the assistant U.S. attorney described how in the Manhattan mansion they found hundreds of thousands, not thousands, hundreds of thousands of photographs of semi-nude, 13, 14, 15-year-old girls. And I don't know what that indicated. And also a trove of diamonds, in his safe. I mean, the New York mansion also, we know you write about some of the people who went there, including Bill Gates, and I think, other elected officials.
Prince Andrew and, and the people that flew on his plane, Bill Clinton, Trump flew on his plane. All these people were in and out of, his life over this time period when he was involved with this sex trafficking operation. The victims, some of them have accused some of the men of being involved. Of course, this is a crime that, doesn't really have any witnesses. When you're in a room with a man doing this to you, there's really nobody there to corroborate it, except for, of course, Epstein, who's gone now. And, there's been a lot of talk of videos, whether he had videos, compromise on some of these men. I mean, we really don't know for sure. I've heard different things from different people. But, it makes you wonder whether anybody else is really going to be held accountable.
Are you still getting tips and leads on this from people out of the blue?
Yeah, I just got a couple this week because the book is getting some press, and I'm hearing from people saying, call me, I know this. So I'll call them all and, see if there's any truth to their tips. Usually, as you know, when you have a story like this, I would say 80-90% of them are not good information. But if you get 1 or 2% that make a difference, one of the tips that I did get after this series ran was the one about the St. Thomas Airport. Air traffic controller had called me, or a friend, I should clarify. It was a friend of an air traffic controller who told him that this air traffic controller had seen him disembark his plane with a bunch of girls.
Well, talking about sources, you write a chapter there about a couple of really sketch characters, Patrick Kessler and Mark Dugan. I mean, those two. I mean, what do you make of that? I mean, it was almost like they were planted, or they were just. What do you think?
I just had to include it because the story is so bizarre. It's almost like if you did a movie about it, you wouldn't believe that these characters actually existed, but they really did. And, the New York Times did a whole, story about the Patrick Kessler, which I knew about as it was unfolding. But quite a few people told me that they thought he was a phony. So I just kept thinking, why is the New York Times still pursuing it? Because everything I was hearing anyway
Tell
was
us
that,
a little detail about what he was up to, Kessler.
well, he claimed that he had video, that somehow he had gotten a hold of these long lost Epstein video, that he had either helped Epstein, I'm trying to remember the details, but he had helped Epstein catalog them or hide them or something to that effect. The name he was, a made up name. He basically showed some of the stills from the video he had to two of the lawyers that represented Virginia Giuffre, who's one of the victims, and it implied that that this was finally evidence against some of these famous men, and it was these videos of some of these famous men that were allegedly involved. And ultimately, he never produced it. The lawyers wanted to authenticate the videos that he claimed he had, and he never produced them, and he just disappeared. So the thought was that he was just a phony.
Right, and you have several characters throughout the book who raise allegations, disappear, and it's almost I think a couple of times you say that it was almost could have been entrapment also from Epstein's lawyers.
Right. I suspect that they were trying to entrap David Boies, who represented Virginia and was the nemesis and remains the nemesis of Alan Dershowitz, who, right after that happened, he filed a motion in his court case against Virginia that, involving this Patrick Kessler thing about how Boies had tried to, use this somehow to blackmail him or others, which was really my research and my interview showed that was not the case. I was talking to David Boies while this was happening, and David was telling me the guy's a fake. So, it's just, I think, the whole story is filled with these characters and these connections. And in the middle of it all are these women that really have never found justice. And that's the sad part about this.
Yeah, I think there are actually some hero lawyers as well, or who did the right thing. I mean, we didn't really talk about Brad Edwards, who I think was really crucial to this in terms of the civil suit cases he filed, and hopefully people will read the book and learn that. But I do want to end, and we're getting near the end, a couple of questions. Near the end of the book, you talk about the reckoning. That's the chapter. And in that, some of the young women actually, it's not that they find retribution or whatever, or even healing, but they're given an opportunity. Can you talk about that and that scene in that courtroom?
Yeah, it was right after Epstein died, and they were going to, it was just normally this kind of hearing is just a formality. It was for the judge to drop the case, essentially. There was no more case because he had died. But the judge wanted to give the women an opportunity to say their piece, to speak about what had happened to them. So quite a number of them showed up for this hearing. And the first thing you notice is they were very similar in the way they carried themselves and they looked. They were, you could tell they had model postures, and they were very slim, and most of them were blonde. And so it was like you could tell because they were all looked alike. And I think that, quite frankly, I went to the ladies' room one time and I could hear them talking to each other, and they're sort of saying, yeah, I remember you. Do you remember this? And they were starting to form this bond. They had been through something so horrible together, and some of them had never met each other before, but they knew some of the same women, or they knew Maxwell, or they knew people that were in that orbit that had answered the door or helped schedule them. So they were finding this common ground and they were using it to support each other.
And that day in court, they were actually able to testify to what had happened to them, not in specific detail of an act, but just the process and who they were brought to, and that they were victims. They were testifying as victims, really, for the first time. And I think in the courtroom there were dozens that day, and only a few ended up testifying. Is that right?
That's right. Well, there were quite a number who spoke out. They not all of them wanted to identify themselves, which was understandable. It was very emotional. Some of them, and I go into this in my book. Some of the stories that they told were horrendous. About how they were taken advantage of. I'm not just talking about sexually, but mentally. The
Yeah.
mental aspect of this is just as important, almost as important a component of what he did. He mentally manipulated them.
Well, as a society now, we're hearing more and more about this, unfortunately. And this is the last question, Julie. I know you've been going all day, and it's evening in Miami. Is there going to be a movie, and who's going to play you?
Oh gosh, there's going to be HBO. Adam McKay, the director, is working on a series, a limited series for HBO about it, and I'm helping with the script. I'm being interviewed all the time by the screenwriter, and we always joke on who's going to play me, and I just, I don't know, I guess.
Well, maybe you have a new career on the big screen.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I'm not very articulate, as you can tell from this interview.
You've been great.
Not.
Well, we're going to end it now, and I really, truly want to thank you for your work. You've made a big difference. You've had a great career, and I'm sure there's a lot ahead of you, and you've overcome your persistence in overcoming obstacles. As I said, is inspirational for a lot of people, and journalists especially. We could have gone much longer, and I just recommend the book for anybody. And I want to thank you for joining us today for this really important conversation. I want to thank our audience here in San Francisco and online around the country. The program today will be available as a video and podcast on the club's website, www.commonwealthclub.org. And I'm Robert Rosenthal, and now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club, the place where you're in the know, is adjourned. Have a good evening. See ya.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.